No sooner had the warm liquid mixed with the crumbs touched my palate than a shiver ran through me and I stopped, intent upon the extraordinary thing that was happening to me. An exquisite pleasure had invaded my senses, something isolated, detached, with no suggestion of its origin. And at once the vicissitudes of life had become indifferent to me, its disasters innocuous, its brevity illusory, this new sensation having had the effect, which love has, of filling me with a precious essence. Or rather, this essence was not in me, it was me. I had ceased now to feel mediocre, contingent, mortal. Whence could it have come to me, this all-powerful joy? I sensed that it was connected with the taste of the tea and the cake, but that it infinitely transcended those savors, could not indeed be of the same nature. Where did it come from? What did it mean? How could I seize and apprehend it? I drink a second mouthful, in which I find nothing more than in the first. Then a third, which gives me rather less than the second. It is time to stop. The potion is losing its virtue. It is plain that the truth I am seeking lies not in the cup, but in myself. The drink has called it into being, but does not know it, and can only repeat indefinitely, with a progressive diminution of strength, the same message which I cannot interpret, though I hope at least to be able to call it forth again, and to find it there presently, intact and at my disposal, for my final enlightenment. I put down the cup and examine my own mind. It alone can discover the truth. But how? What an abyss of uncertainty whenever the mind feels overtaken by itself, when it, the seeker, is at the same time the dark region through which it must go seeking, and where all its equipment will avail it nothing. Seek? More than that, create. It is face to face with something which does not yet exist, which it alone can make actual, which it alone can bring into the light of day. Hey, this is Nathan.
This is David.
And this is Nick. You're listening to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast. Today we are kicking off reading Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time. So starting with Volume 1, Swann's Way. And we rolled the dice or picked straws or whatever we did at the beginning where I get to summarize this book. So here goes. We learn at the beginning of Swann's Way that the narrator likes to go to bed early. So that was pretty cool.
Ditto.
Yeah, same. That's why I identify with this so strongly. So we get a lot about the narrator growing up in the country home at Cambrai. Sort of sets the atmosphere for the majority of the first section of the book. And there's an incredibly lengthy portion where we get all of the details about really wanting a kiss goodnight from his mom. That was cool, I guess. We get the introduction to the character of Charles Swann, who is over for dinner and thus distracting the mom from providing the goodnight kiss. How's this going? This is going really well.
Yeah.
Perfect. Does anything happen in this book? All right. We get the famous Madeline memory situation that we heard at the very beginning. Beautiful reading by Nathan. Nathan, nice work.
Thank you.
That sort of sets up the concept of memory and this motif that is continually cycled around for pretty much the whole book, from what I can tell. I guess spontaneous memory. We'll go with that. Let's see what else happens in this thing. So we hear that Swann is kind of married to somebody that maybe he shouldn't have been, below his station, a little racy, something like that.
Do you have that passage? Because I forgot that was mentioned, and obviously
that's funny. I forgot the Madeline passage until I realized that everybody thought that it was amazing, and that's the thing that they remembered. And I was like, I didn't remember the passage about remembering that everybody's
and you're like, ooh, racy
super
love
into.
Story.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Scandalous. Read on.
I don't have the passage where they kind of hint at the station of his wife. It's kind of like kept hush. I remember they were talking about where
she just never came to dinner, right?
Exactly. He only does his social obligation stuff separately, and it's kind of like I can't tell if he's embarrassed or if society has basically dictated that, and he's just sort of going with the flow. There's a lot of like social stuff in here about like the right way to do things and operate in high society that I don't really get.
A lot of it's dictated by family hierarchy. So like the grandfather says, hey, I hear they're not home, so let's cut through part of their property, the Swann property. And it's kind of hinted like they don't want to see Odette, and they just don't want to see Odette at all. And so they cut through, and then doesn't something happen where young narrator catches his first glimpse of
Gilbert.
Gilbert?
There's a great passage where he he falls in love with her, but he's a child, right? He's like 8, I don't know, something like that. And he says, I think this is right when he met her. I loved her. I was sorry not to have had the time and the inspiration to insult her, to hurt her, to force her to keep some memory of me. I thought her so beautiful that I should have liked to be able to retrace my steps so as to shake my fist at her and shout, I think you're hideous, grotesque, how I loathe you.
Marcel Proust is just so good at capturing the 8-year-old thoughts.
I did something very similar when I was young, except I just went straight to, ew, cooties. Yeah. Which I think,
this is just
more succinct.
It's a difference in generation thing. They were just classier back then. Vocab, it's all just deteriorated. Kids these days, quote unquote. So yeah, I guess you hinted at the walks. So we get the introduction of the 2 walks, Swann's Way versus, and I just have to give the disclaimer that I personally, and probably all of us, are just not going to be good at French pronunciations. So Guermantes Way, is that what we're going with?
Sounds good to me.
The noble way, I suppose. That's what it symbolizes, I think. So we get the 2 walks. I guess I forgot about this piece, but is it the grandmother who just refuses not to listen to the rules given to her, that she shouldn't be out walking and shouldn't be out in the rain and things like that? Did I make that up? Did that happen this?
It's not ringing a bell.
Really?
Yeah, there's someone, but it's like a small passage. Someone that
she's
kind of
like
walks
fiery and
whenever she wants. Yeah.
Yeah, she's supposed to be kind of on I don't know, bed rest or something. But
well,
anyway,
that's the aunt that never leaves her bedroom.
See, this is okay. Well, I guess I don't have my reading comprehension skills down. This is actually my worry about trying to talk about this book is which of the 7 things did you remember versus the 7 things that I rememred? Like
Aunt Leonie, she stays in her bed and gossips with this woman that comes to see her after church all the time. She's always ill. She's very particular about what her maid or housekeeper does or doesn't do. And
Francoise was her maid, right?
I believe so.
And then she later,
correct.
When Aunt Leonie dies, she becomes the maid
of narrator's family.
Aunt Leonie. That whole scenario was pretty funny too, and how people had to treat her just right, they couldn't overindulge her.
And it kind of seems like what the narrator may be like as an adult. Talks about how he's just lying in bed all the time and he doesn't know what room he's in when he wakes up, which the way he wrote about that is if that was a common thing.
I feel like that'll happen to me in a hotel room. I'll be confused.
Yeah, but not in your own home. And then you start remembering all the beds you've slept in and all the rooms you've been in. You're like, what? Every once in a while there's passages in books that are written as if this is common knowledge. I'm like, am I the fucking person that doesn't know what he's talking about?
Maybe you haven't slept in a lot of beds.
Well, that was a burn.
Proust was a sickly fellow.
Yeah.
I mean, a narrator is Proust.
Ish.
Well, do we know that yet? Proust-ish.
The narrator also has severe asthma or something that prevents him from traveling to Europe near the end of the book also. So
traveling to Europe?
Is that or around
within Europe?
I don't remember where it was he wanted to travel to. Paris?
Also in Europe.
It's still to Europe. No?
I mean,
from Europe to Europe.
Yeah. If you want to die on that mound, go for it, but I don't typically tell people that I'm traveling to America when I'm leaving from California.
But it's not true that you're traveling to America.
Yes, it is. To travel to, you have to be without.
If I said you are not traveling to America, then where are you traveling to?
I'm traveling within America.
I would just also like to say that the
within?
The level of detail here symbolizes what it's like to read Proust.
If you're traveling to a place, you are outside of it. Think of a city. I'm traveling to Indianapolis. You're not in Indianapolis.
This is inter versus intra.
I'm going to have to sit on this one for a while.
I wouldn't. That sounds like a waste of time.
Moving on. Okay. The narrator may or may not be Marcel Proust. He's going on his walks. He has that sort of weird eavesdropping moment on the 2 ladies who are doing some romance.
Spitting on the dead father's photo.
Yeah, that was
some interesting passage there about like why their extreme sensitivities would lead them to desecrate a beloved
Oh
figure.
yeah, and he goes into like the difference between someone who's evil and yeah.
I thought that was a very insightful, interesting take on that.
Do you have a passage?
It is possible that without being in the least inclined towards sadism, a daughter might be guilty of equally cruel offenses as those of Mademoiselle
just do it.
Vinteuil against the memory and the wishes of her dead father. But she would not give them deliberate expression in an act so crude in its symbolism, so lacking in subtlety. The criminal element in her behavior would be less evident to other people, and even to herself, since she would not admit to herself that she was doing wrong. And that goes on for a little while, and then this is also a nice passage. And when they allow themselves for a moment to enjoy it, they endeavor to impersonate, to identify with the wicked, and to make their partners do likewise, in order to gain the momentary illusion of having escaped beyond the control of their own gentle and scrupulous natures into the inhuman world of pleasure.
Yeah, there's that quote, "A sadist of her kind is an artist in evil, which a wholly wicked person could not be. For in that case, the evil would not have been external, it would have seemed quite natural to her, and would not even have been distinguishable from herself. And as for virtue, respect for the dead, filial affection, since she would never have practiced the cult of these things, she would take no impious delight in profaning them." Just a weird distinction between like someone who's a sadist and someone who's pure evil. And it goes on for like quite a while.
That was actually the passage that I was thinking of, David, and ironically, I didn't highlight it. I highlighted just above it and just below it, so I skipped right over it.
Moving on, we hit the Swann in Love section, which is my personal favorite. It's kind of the hit of Swann's Way.
Wait.
So we basically... What?
Is that really your favorite section of the book?
Is it not yours? It's where all the action happens.
My favorite is literally everything except for that.
Oh, okay. We'll get into this. Is this because you don't have like infatuation emotions like everyone else who also doesn't know which bed they woke up in that morning?
I mean, no, I think that there's aspects of it that I can relate to, and there's good passages. To me, it just seemed to last for a long time, getting into all these details, and like nothing's really developing. You're just in this man's obsessive thought processes for 300 pages.
Yeah, that's what it feels like inside me. So I guess, Swann in Love, like you said, it is pretty repetitive. A lot of it kind of focuses around, we're going to go pronunciations again, Madame Verdurin, sort of the hostess of this sort of collection of characters.
The little nucleus, the little group, the little clan of the...
There it is.
Verdurins.
Verdurins? Yeah, perfect. And so Odette is built into this crew as well. And so we start to see the continually cycling and increasing obsessions of Swann with Odette. That goes on for the whole thing, as Nathan noted. We get the introduction of the Vinteuil phrase or sonata, the section of music that essentially Swann needed Shazam to figure out what it was, but it took him a bunch of times until he finally made the connection.
Yeah, that piece of music works like the Madeline for the narrator. It just keeps triggering him to go back to these built-in false memories of his initial love for Odette.
Yeah, and so we just get these continually increasing obsessive loops, and it's hard to break out each individual one, but essentially the whole thing ends with Swann saying, "And I didn't even like her," as he falls out of love with her. "Wasn't even my type. What's the deal?"
But of course we know they get married and have a child.
Yes.
Hey, a big reveal.
We read it in the first part of the book, dude.
I guess we kind of gave that away.
But so there is a really interesting thing where like they reference it at the beginning where Swann's, wife is talked about in this capacity. And then you have the whole Swann's Way thing where it's talking about Swann and Odette. And then in the third part of the book, at some point they just mention that it is Odette. And it's kind of like it's this reveal, but like they actually don't stitch it together. like that. It's just this sort of like, oh yeah, by the way, it's Odette. Like you sort of know the whole time, but it's not like.
I really liked the way he
moment.
did that, actually. And it wasn't, I don't know that I would have pieced it all together. I'm not that quick. But I read about the film, which gave it away. And then at book club, somebody gave it away before I had read that part. But I think it would have been enjoyable to like kind of, you're like, it is Odette, right? It is Odette, right? And then finally, he just straight up says it. But he does kind of like extend that period of not quite admitting that it is Odette.
Yeah. Actually, so in the Swann in Love section, it reminded me, and David, I'm curious if you feel this way at all. At some point really early on, we were reading The Recognitions by William Gaddis.
Oh, yeah.
There were all of those like incredibly lengthy sort of painful party scenes that just went on. And I remember you just being like, these are the fucking worst. And I'm like, I like it. I like how just banal and repetitive, and like there's all these details that you can either dig into or sort of just skip and it doesn't really matter. And I was like, oh, that seems like an echo that Gaddis is doing of like all of these like insufferable sort of like social like gathering things in Proust.
Yeah, I picked up on that, and I also felt the same way. I was like, oh, come on. Like, I get it, but do we need to keep doing this over and over again? And then when I got to the passage on page 406, after Swann is sort of kicked out of this little group, and he's kind of going off on them, and he says, upon my word, these people are really sublime in their bourgeois mediocrity. They can't be real. They must all have come out of a labiche comedy. And then just the next paragraph. Could anything be more grotesque than the lives of these non-entities hanging on to one another like that? The way he just kind of realizes how fucking awful they are. The way they play. Yeah,
they're like proto-beat poets of the 50s, just in late 1800s France.
Like the rich version.
Yeah.
That, I only want to hear this part of the poem, and I don't want to think too much about this. And if people don't want to be at my dinner party, then they are the worst, kind of thing. It's just.
But they were kind of the hipsters, right? I mean, they were rich, but they were nouveau riche. They were not like the established rich, like Swann and the princesses and all of that. And so in that part of society, they weren't seen as rich. I mean, they were, but they weren't seen as like
old money versus new money.
They were just hipsters trying to like demonstrate culture.
Which goes back to what we were talking about before we started this podcast about living in San Francisco.
Sorry, go there.
Just because I have vinyl records and I'm trying to be cultured and we're mispronouncing a bunch of French words right now doesn't make it true.
Reading Proust.
Yeah. All right, so Swann in Love.
Wait, can we read?
We'll just conclude.
Oh wait,
you got a section.
Well, I was just going to read the last line because we talked about
perfect.
How you fell out of love with Odette, but the last line's like really the
clincher,
whatever.
Okay.
To think that I've wasted years of my life, that I've longed to die, that I've experienced my greatest love for a woman who didn't appeal to me, who wasn't even my type.
Yeah. So in summary, Swann in Love is the best section. Moving on.
Nope. It does have my favorite passage, though, when he's just so enraptured with the music. I loved that the best because, like Nick, I'm a music nerd.
Yeah, I like highlighted like
there's
multiple
a
pages in a row.
Sections. I don't know where the big one is, but what page is that?
This is 497. And by the way, for the reader, we're reading, because we keep mentioning page numbers, the Modern Library Classics, translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief and Terence Kilmartin. So that's the one we're referencing.
Are you going to drop a quote on us?
It's a long one. Do you want me to read it? It's a long one.
Sure.
He knew that the very memory of the piano falsified still further the perspective in which he saw the elements of music. That the field open to the musician is not a miserable stave of 7 notes, but an immeasurable keyboard, still almost entirely unknown, on which, here and there only, separated by the thick darkness of its unexplored tracks, some few among the millions of keys of tenderness, of passion, of courage, of serenity which compose it, each one differing from all the rest as one universe differs from another, have been discovered by a few great artists who do us the service when they awaken in us the emotion corresponding to the theme they have discovered, of showing us what richness, what variety lies hidden, unknown to us, in that vast, unfathomed, and forbidding night of our soul, which we take to be an impenetrable void. Vinteuil had been one of those musicians. In his little phrase, although it might present a clouded surface to the eye of reason, one sensed a content so solid, so consistent, so explicit, to which it gave so new, so original a force, that those who had once heard it preserved the memory of it on an equal footing with the ideas of the intellect. Swann referred back to it as to a conception of love and happiness whose distinctive character he recognized at once as he would have that of the Princess de Clèves, or of Renée, should either of those titles occur to him. Even when he was not thinking of the little phrase, it existed latent in his mind, on the same footing as certain other notions without material equivalent, such as our notions of light, of sound, of perspective, of physical pleasure, the rich possessions wherewith our inner temple is diversified and adorned. Perhaps we shall lose them, perhaps they will be obliterated if we return to nothingness. But so long as we are alive, we can no more bring ourselves to a state in which we shall not have known them than we can with regard to any material object. Then we can, for example, doubt the luminosity of a lamp that has just been lit, in view of the changed aspect of everything in the room, from which even the memory of the darkness has vanished. In that way, Vinteuil's phrase, like some theme, say, in Tristan, which represents to us also a certain emotional accretion, had espoused our mortal state, had endued a vesture of humanity that was peculiarly affecting. Its destiny was linked to the future, to the reality of the human soul, of which it was one of the most special and distinctive ornaments. Perhaps it is not being that is the true state, and all our dream of life is inexistent. But if so, we feel that these phrases of music, these conceptions which exist in relation to our dream, must be nothing either. We shall perish, but we have as our hostages these divine captives who will follow and share our fate, and death in their company is somehow less bitter, less inglorious, perhaps even less probable. I mean, damn, that's maybe one of my favorite chunks of highlighted writing that I've ever highlighted.
It's amazing.
That's why that section's the best. Okay, we're almost through the summary. Then we can actually talk about what this whole thing means or might mean. So into the third section, kind of a smaller piece, place names dash the name. We can talk about what that means. But there's a lot of discussion about essentially the narrator preferring to basically name things, preferring to read about things before he visits places. And if he visits a place without reading about it first, it seems less interesting to him or less appealing. He needs the time to, I guess, form in his imagination what that is before he gets there. And that was a crazy, he starts dipping into, what is reality? What is, imagination? How do these things mix? So kind of the beginning chunk of that to me was incredibly appealing, I would say. And then we basically end up with, getting into the narrator's sort of continued or rather increased obsessions with Swann's daughter. And I'm going to lean on Nathan for pronunciation of the name.
Gilbert.
Okay. I was just about to default back to Gilberte. I forgot.
Good old.
But yeah, so we start to see some of the same sort of obsessive patterns there, which actually brings up one of my first questions about this book that I've been thinking a lot about, where this book is, it's kind of described in the introduction of this version that we're reading, where it's straddling sort of the classic novel and a modernist novel, sort of going back and forth between the forms. So we get like sort of the classic, novel of manners, stuff like that. And then we get this sort of really intense, super detailed, very aesthetic sort of modernist approach too. But one thing I was just thinking about is how much detail we get in the interiority of Swann. And the narrator is sort of recounting that, but obviously was not there in that detail. Where does that come from? What do you do as a reader? Like, is that something you just sort of submit to? Like, where does that fit? Because eventually when you start to see the same echoes of it, when the narrator's talking about his obsessions with his new love, Gilbert, it starts to feel pretty similar, right? And so is this like actually a thing that happened with Swann, or is it just a projection of the narrator? Like, how do you make peace with that?
At first, I was reading this second section as just a separate narrative completely, until the narrator sort of interjects with, "Oh, my grandfather tried to stop Swann from seeing these people." And I was like, oh, it's the same person sort of retelling
it
this.
is the narrator.
Yeah. So it took me, I don't know how many pages into it before I realized that. And at first I was kind of like, oh, well, the framing of it is too impossible to maintain.
Mm-hmm.
And so my first thought was, oh, that's kind of shitty. But then as you read and as you sort of look at what came before and what came after, you just sort of accept that he is using Swann's story, which is, at least partially true, as a basis to sort of better understand what may be his own obsession with Swann's daughter later, which I believe is what book 2 is going to be about. But I'm not 100% sure. But whatever he's doing, he's using it for his own ways to sort of describe and capture, I think, these emotions of obsession, memory, and love.
I'm not super familiar with the form of the novel, I guess, in the 19th century. And this is like turn of the 20th century. This is like really early 20th century when he wrote this.
Came out in the teens. Is that right?
I think, 1913. Something like that.
Yeah, the first one.
When this was published or written. But is this sort of projection that he's projecting his personal feelings or experience into Swann's mind or into Swann's experience and then telling it as if it's his experience? Was that a novel approach to the novel at this point in time?
I would say so. Like a classic approach is just like, omniscient third person narrator. And you just accept that there's this way of knowing everybody's thoughts where it's relevant, right? And I guess what seems different about this is that split, that exactly what David talked about, where at some point it feels like it's just kind of falling back into that. But when the narrator sort of represents himself, you realize that it can't possibly be true in that way that it's being written. And I feel like that sort of starting to play with the form stuff. Defining modernism in literature is probably harder to do than I'm capable of. But to me, it's like it's utilizing the form in a really specific way that sets up either an aesthetic or some sort of artistic goal, trying to ultimately describe a thing in the way that is more relevant than just this sort of more factual, structured approach. And so to me, that kind of like transitions into that mindset with that sort of narrator structure of Swann and Love.
And the term that I'm sure you've heard, Nathan, stream of consciousness in narrative is associated with modernism. And you see that in Joyce and Woolf, but I think you see it here as well. His is less, I think, experimental and more impressionistic. It's playing with time and how the mind works and how things appear in the mind and how you recall things, and they sort of blend together and move in ways that are not simply linear.
But more indicative of how you actually might sort of feel or interpret the world in reality.
Although I'd say this is much more labor-intensive than reality for most people, including my dim-witted self.
I mean, that sets up like a whole other thing, right? Which is like the length of time, right? How many minutes or hours go by in your life that is just like that. It's just over. But if you actually focus on a thing, you can almost elongate it.
Oh, yeah.
Right? If you really want to, you can almost change time. And in some level, I think, it's funny, we're already trying to figure out what this book is about, but, we're one volume into 6. And so to me, it's the equivalent of being, a sixth of the way through a 400-page book, which is just like barely getting started. Essentially, this seems to me like a goal or an endeavor of the narrator setting this up, which is basically trying to recapture time, trying to control it. And you can do that through memory, but also it's not this perfectly controlled process. Because as we've seen with the Madeline and the phrase of the music is that it is at some level this unknown thing that can be completely triggered or instigated by these moments that just sort of overpower you at like a sensory level. So I think he's kind of setting up that to play with.
And there's a word that we haven't talked about that is, I didn't really think about as I was reading until I got to the last passage, which I'm going to read real quick, which is, "The places we have known do not belong only to the world of space on which we map them out for our own convenience. They were only a thin slice held between the contiguous impressions that composed our life at that time. The memory of a particular image is but regret for a particular moment, and houses, roads, avenues are as fugitive, alas, as the years." That idea of regret, like when I got to that, I was like, oh, maybe that's what this is sort of building towards. This idea of falling back into memory to sort of deal with regrets. You saw that in Nathan's passage that he read about Swann going, this woman's not even my type. Why am I so obsessed with this? Which is a funny way to end 300 pages of obsession. It's like the most brutal shaggy dog joke.
Yeah.
Let me drown you in minutia for 300 pages for a man to realize, what was I doing?
But it's also
true.
fairly accurate.
And, yeah.
Like, that's what I love about it, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's how these things, like, at some level, like, your emotions and stuff are just completely, like, redlined.
Yeah.
And it's irrational and all this stuff. And then there's this thing that happens that just, like, releases you. And you're like, what? What was that? Like, our brains are just very, very weird, faulty mechanisms that, like, we're all saddled with.
I think we're going to get deep into this in a second. But that last section, David, that you read, kind of the very closer of this book, it kind of shifts time again, right? It's like present day, I guess. And he's adult narrator walking through the bois again, where he had fallen in love with Gilbert, and looking at the flowers and looking at the way that the fashions, the way people are dressed, and looking at the motor cars that have replaced the carriages. And for me, reading that section, which kind of almost takes place apart from the rest of the narrative and provides a sort of explanation for the narrative, casts the whole book in a different light for me. The whole thing's been kind of detached. I really enjoy the intellectual passages and his kind of figuring things out and describing these deep workings of the subconscious and whatnot, but it didn't have a whole lot of personal, emotional significance, I felt like, coming from the narrator until that last passage. And then it's just like, it's so nostalgic. It's so like, I want to stop time. Mm-hmm. I want to make a real place for these memories, a place that's permanent, that doesn't move with fashion, that doesn't speed up, that is held in stone forever. And that both has made me feel very sad. Like, it's kind of like descended on me and imbued my own memories with this feeling of nostalgia that I would just as soon avoid. And also made me appreciate the whole book more, I think.
I'm with you on that. And I have a sort of related question, because I found this happening to me a lot while I was reading this, and also when we were reading Sebald. But I would have my own sort of Madeline or Sonata moments where, like, I would read a passage and all of a sudden it would trigger this memory, and I would get lost, and all of a sudden I'm like, shit, I just read like 2 pages. I have no idea what I read. I was in my own mind doing something else. But did you have a similar experience at all? Is it simply because it's memory based, or is it the writing? What is it that makes that happen for you?
I think there's because this definitely happens a lot in reading Proust, is just there's something about the rhythm of it that I don't want to say lulls you to sleep, but it's obviously not plot driven. Like, let's just get that out of the way. But it is so, like, heavy on the senses, and it's so heavy into, I guess, yeah, just these concepts of memory and whatnot. But, like, I think the cadence of it allows you to kind of detach and sort of, like, float away from it. Mm. And so, like, there's definitely sections that are engaging, but I feel like it's almost brought on by, like, the aesthetic and, like, the style of prose. So, like, yes, the fact that there's topics related to that is one thing, but his way of just, like, cycling around, like, an idea or a concept and trying to, like, work it out in his head, to me, sort of, like, almost instills that mentality in me as a reader. And then it kind of, like, primes me to get into that kind of state. And so I would attribute it slightly less to actually just the topics of memory, even though I think that that's important, but more so just, like, I don't know, the vibe that it gives off.
Same for me. I mean, I think less in the actual act of reading did I drift off into that space, but I have found over the last few weeks that memories from my childhood have just come back to me more vivid than I've felt in a very long time. Like, it's not an intellectual memory of something, but like I remember how that felt. I remember the feeling of the smell and the feeling of the air surrounding this time or this object. And I think for me, it's kind of all the above. It's like his writing is very seductive. It's the rhythm of it, also the subject matter, like saying, what is a memory? We can't weigh it, we can't measure it, but he's saying it is absolutely important. And I'm going to spend all this time showing you how important it is and pulling it all out, pulling all the details out of this memory. And I think that empathizing with that, because that's what we do when we read, right? We empathize with the voice of the work, and empathizing with that voice that's telling us this is so important and I'm going to reveal that to you. And then being seduced by the style, like Nick said, kind of creates that space in our own minds that then we fill with our own memories.
I think he also gets into how like those ultimately have their own limitations too, right? And so so he says, these images were false for another reason also, namely that they were necessarily much simplified. Doubtless whatever it was that my imagination aspired to, that my senses took in only incompletely and without immediate pleasure, I had committed to the safe custody of names. Doubtless, because I had accumulated there a store of dreams, those names now magnetize my desires. But the names themselves are not very comprehensive. And I think he's also trying to get into how it works at a functional level almost, which is like, we don't actually remember the stuff. We remember a copy of the memory and a copy of the memory.
Or we create.
You're right.
I think there's a passage, I think in the passage that I read at some point, he says, actually it's creation. But also he kind of closes it. Like, actually I kind of want to read that passage because there's right near the end, he talks about, he's looking at these things and he doesn't feel them anymore. He's like, well, is it because they don't have them or because I can't create it?
Yeah. I don't know if this has happened to you, but like, I don't look at photos a whole lot just because everybody seems to take a photo of everything. And for, my adult life, even before, iPhones and we're documenting all this stuff, like people still had cameras. And for whatever reason, I just haven't been a person who takes photos or like looks at them. But every once in like a long time, I'll look at photos of stuff that happened, now 15, 20 years ago. And it's funny because I remember a lot of this stuff, but it is fundamentally different than like what the photo documented. And so like part of me, always fighting, like, is it better to try to remember the thing accurately? Or is it better to just commit to your own memory and deal with whatever version or distortion or copy of a copy of a copy you end up with? Which one's better? Which one's more accurate? And I think which one's more
real?
I think he's trying to figure that out too. And the answer in some ways is neither is real because neither is actually reality, right?
Ooh, you keep taunting me. You're like, here it is. Come get it.
Yeah.
Come get it.
Come on. Nick, you can't tease Nathan with metaphysics.
Come on, give us a passage, Nathan. What do you got?
Here it is. I actually had randomly, the book was already open to this passage. Absolutely random. Was not prepared for this. 603. But when a belief vanishes, there survives it more and more vigorously so as to cloak the absence of the power now lost to us of imparting reality to new things, a fetishistic attachment to the old things, which it did once animate, as if it was in them and not in ourselves that the divine spark resided, and as if our present incredulity had a contingent cause, the death of the gods.
Oh, that's where he's walking through the bois and looking at everything, yeah.
All right, so should we actually get into the
book?
Get it?
What have you been talking about this whole time? Wait, I have a question for Nathan, because this came up, we were talking in the local reading group, is that, Nathan, you mentioned that this book was funny to you.
Oh, yeah.
And I want to hear about that because I think a couple episodes ago we talked about, has anybody ever laughed out loud while reading? And you're like, no, I don't do that. And David, you were like, no, I don't do that either. So how is this a funny book to you? Because I sometimes would smile, I guess. There was, like not outward jokes, but like humorous circumstances, I suppose. But what is your advertisement for this being a book of humor? That's my question.
I thought that the Verderon Club, they were like a comedy troupe. It was like The Office. They were so cringy, like the doctor who wanted so bad to be cool, and he kept like throwing in puns. Like whenever he heard a word that he recognized, it just like triggered a pun, no matter what the context was. So like I think in one passage, Swann was describing like an aesthetic experience that he had, and then he said some word, and the doctor just like yells out some pun with that word that nobody gets.
It's like a Michael Scott scenario.
And then and then Swann like pauses and then just continues, but he's like, what?
Yeah, and there's a moment where the doctor also like blurts out some sort of inappropriate pun to somebody else, and it mentions that he was just waiting in the conversation like a fucking panther ready to pounce, just like, all right, and he just like launches. Yeah, it's very amusing. And the madam who just suffers from apparently everyone and everything. If they don't play the right kind of music, or if they start playing the music too early, she gets a headache. They have to like take care of her. It's the whole thing's a farce.
Or the passage when with the princess, when he's at the princess's party or whatever, Swann is, and then I don't fully understand this one, but he like makes some metaphorical statement about how she's just stepped out of the garden and, blessed us with her presence or whatever. And it's kind of this like high language. And this woman next to him was like, she just came from the garden? I didn't even know that. And then, but instead of explaining himself, it's like he learned to deal with these kinds of people who don't understand.
Even with Odette, he gives her this long 1.5-page, 2-page speech about how if she loves him, he must stay and not go to the opera. And she doesn't understand a word he's saying and like interrupts him near the end and goes, I'm sorry, I'm going to be late for the overture. And she just like rushes out in the middle of this, what I think she interprets as a harangue or something. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but
yeah, he does feel like he's just sort of isolated in his life, right? That there's all this just like swirling, like you said earlier, like new rich hipster folk, and like he's just trying to, I don't know, lead some sort of more like aesthetic life or some sort of purposeful thing, and it's just like nobody speaks the same language. It's just like disconnect all around.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that.
And I think the narrator attaches himself to Swann, and the reader, like Nathan just said, we are supposed to also connect and I think relate to being Swann in these moments.
But did you actually laugh? Like, are you laughing when you read like?
Yes, there was at least one passage with the doctor where I laughed.
I believe that. I smiled.
I laughed.
No audible laughter.
I'm pretty sure. I made a noise.
Pretty sure. Did it actually happen, or did you remember it happening?
I definitely remember
the memory of laughing while reading Swann's Way.
I cannot say with absolute certainty whether it actually happened, and there were no witnesses.
Nobody can. That's the thing. Nobody can.
Yeah, but I remember it, and that's real enough.
I think we need to start a live feed anytime Nathan decides to read, and just stream it. Watch you read.
Probably be more popular than this podcast somehow.
It fucking would be too. Well.
Okay, so I mean, are we gonna get into this? What is this?
You keep saying that.
Well, what? Let's start with this. Did you like it? Like, what was your rating or overall impression of it, Nick?
Okay. Yes. So I like it. I know this is a lazy comment, and I know that Proust is obviously detailed and beautiful prose and all that. But did we need all of it? Probably not. There's just so many like belabored details that don't necessarily introduce a new thing. And I'm ready for that, and I'm down with it, like happy to read all sorts of incredibly long tomes and stuff. At some point I realized that it becomes less of a problem and more of just like a feeling of you reading that. I'm okay with repetitive stuff. But that was kind of the thing that sometimes might lose me a little bit. So I love these descriptions. I love these concepts. I have like gotten hooked into it, and I'm really excited to see where like these topics of reality and memory and like how we access it and how we deal with time, the progression of time. Love to see where that goes. But I would be lying if I was like, this is incredible, I loved every single page. Part of me is just like, could have made it a little tighter. Could have tightened that up right there. But then again, like, I think one of the points of the whole structure of it is him trying, like, as a writer, not the narrator, just literally the human Marcel Proust, trying to slow down time by documenting everything. And if you've ever tried to write stuff, and I'm, the most amateur of writers of all time, but one thing that stuck out to me when reading this is I remember, like, if you're writing something and you have stuff that you want to get through, you have like a section of your outline, you're like, okay, this is what I'm going to write today. It always blew my mind how long it took to actually physically get the stuff out of your brain onto the page. And like, it all kind of existed in your brain, but to like document it was truly a labor. And so at some level, like, I'm just impressed that somebody did this, that it's not a fun thing to get all of that out of your brain, like, onto the page. Like, that's manual labor to a certain extent. And so there must be an aesthetic reason behind it, but that still doesn't change the fact that I'm like, we could have used a little less. Probably still would have gotten the same emotions and plot and aesthetics across. So that's kind of where I'm at.
I'm right there in the same boat with you, and you actually reminded me of a question I wanted to ask both of you, because I suffer from this whenever I read passages of description, even if it is beautiful, of nature, a lot of descriptions of nature. And maybe it's because I was born and raised in cities, so I don't connect to it, and I have a hard time picturing or trying to imagine what they want me to feel or imagine as a reader. When I'm reading these passages, it's just like, oh, and trees, tree lead, and the tree field green. Like, my brain might as well be in... because, like, you could mention flower names and tree names, and in my head, I'm just picturing, like, a few random forests that I remember, or fields. But, like, I'm not picturing whatever it is he's writing about. I don't have that in me. Mm-hmm. I don't know what that is about intense descriptions of nature when I come across them in books.
Yeah.
Am I alone in this? Do you feel at all similar?
No, I think you're right. I also think there was like a certain type of leisurely intellectual, I'm going for long walks and thinking about it. Like, I mean, this is like proto Sebald in that case, right? I mean, that's what he's doing in his books. I'm walking around and thinking about these ideas.
Yeah, but the ideas are there, and he's usually focused on like the ruins of some man-made object, which I can picture much more clearly in my mind and connect to.
Than the purely like rural.
I go hiking, but I'm thinking about other things. I'm not just, or if I'm interested in nature, it's maybe much more of like, let me just sit here and breathe quietly and not think about anything kind of thing. Not how can I describe this view necessarily.
Yeah. I mean, I guess my thought is it's kind of like it feels of the times in that way, in like, think of original setups, right? In terms of like where you lived and like with your money and what rich people had, is like living in cities in like the late 1800s was a filthy, disgusting place, right? Like, I even just think about this because I have like a fireplace that I can put wood in, and how much like it smells. Just remember that like cities, they were all heated with fireplaces. Like, that's why literally, like, when you read these old books, like, people have to go to get like a rest cure in this place with good air somewhere. Yeah. It's because like these densely populated areas were disgusting, right? And so I think a lot of it comes from this sort of like, escaping to the country and almost like in a weird way bragging of like how great it is. And like, look at what I'm connecting with, and look at this like more pure moment, while the masses are kind of just, slugging it out in this like disgusting sewage, smoke-filled populace. And of course they go back and forth, right? Between Paris and Cambrai. But like, yeah, to me, it's almost a thing that I don't totally connect with either. Sort of like, what's the point? What's the point of these vines, or, this specific flower, or this and that? And so, yeah, I guess I'm in your camp.
I would say that I often feel that way. I with this book, I didn't feel that. I think that his this is one thing that I really love about it, is his ability to take that aesthetic experience and then sort of translate it into a world of ideas.
Yeah, there's
Like,
moments.
the passage that I thought of when you said that was
Are you thinking of when he's a kid and he gets obsessed with that one
the Hawthorns.
row? Yeah, that
Yeah.
gets me. But yeah, please, Nathan, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I just pulled up that passage with the Hawthorns. But it was in vain that I had lingered beside the Hawthorns, breathing in their invisible and unchanging odor, trying to fix it in my mind, which did not know what to do with it, losing it, recapturing it, absorbing myself in the rhythm which disposed the flowers here and there with a youthful light-heartedness. And at intervals as unexpected as certain intervals in music, they went on offering me the same charm in inexhaustible profusion, but without letting me delve any more deeply, like those melodies which one can play 100 times in succession without coming any nearer to their secret. I turned away from them for a moment so as to be able to return to them afresh. My eyes traveled up the bank, which rose steeply to the fields beyond the hedge, alighting on a stray poppy, or a few laggard cornflowers, which decorated the slope here and there like the border of a tapestry, whereupon may be glimpsed sporadically the rustic theme, which will emerge triumphant in the panel itself. Infrequent stills spaced out like the scattered houses which herald the approach of a village. They betokened to me the vast expanse of waving corn beneath the fleecy clouds. And the sight of a single poppy, hoisting upon its slender rigging and holding against the breeze its scarlet ensign over the buoy of rich black earth from which it sprang, made my heart beat like that of a traveler who glimpses, on some low-lying ground, a stranded boat, which is being caulked and made seaworthy, and cries out, although he has not yet caught sight of it, "The sea!"
It's good stuff.
I'd like to see a flower like that. That gave me that feeling.
In the next paragraph, he talks about that feeling and says, "They themselves offered me no enlightenment, and I could not call upon any other flowers to satisfy this mysterious longing." Talking about like looking at the flowers, they well up in him this desire of art, like true art, which is another obsession we haven't really talked about. That he's obsessed with both visual and written art.
I would take that a step further. And on the topic of rating this book, I tend to agree with both of y'all in what you said. And I wasn't quite sure how I was going to feel about it because there were sections, the middle section, I was falling asleep and having a hard time getting through it.
The best
but
section.
I think I think on the whole, I really love it. And it's because of what he's trying to do. I think in my reading, like he is obsessed with art and music, but he's, I think, most obsessed with the world of idea, in that in this modern world, we're propelling ourselves towards the world of matter. And he's saying, hold up. The world of idea is so much more important than the world of matter. And I'm going to try to take you there because it doesn't play by the same rules as the world of matter. It's so much harder to categorize and quantify. And through like his artistry and dedication to this idea, I think he makes, in all of our experience, like it brought up our own memories. It increased our own sensibilities. He makes for the reader more real the world of ideas.
Yeah. Have you found yourself actually trying to pay attention to stuff more? I do, actually. Just, you're in a spot, actually just pay attention to what's around you and see what you can get out of it rather than, quickly checking your email. Like, It has inspired me at a certain level, and that's why I think it's actually pretty powerful. Because if you can get something that changes your behaviors, even a tiny degree, versus all of our external circumstances that are kind of establishing the guardrails of our life. And so to me, that's pretty cool. Not a lot of stuff makes me interpret my surroundings in a different way. And so I think that's good. And quite frankly, that it hasn't really happened since we read Tolstoy, I think. Tolstoy also made me look at how I interpret things and really view them through like a different lens. And so it has that powerful quality. And so that's the number one thing going for it, I would say.
I can't wait to actually get into the next book.
Oh, I thought you were going to jump ship.
Me?
Oh, that's right.
No, I think that was a particularly down moment in the book where I was just like, I don't know if I could keep doing this.
This is, I mean, I do have to just say, right? So we're reading this with like the local book club too, and it has just completely splintered it. Some people are incredibly down, and other ones are just like, I'm never touching that, or have like attempted and just like gotten real like anti super fast.
And here's the thing: I understand both points of view, honestly.
Yeah,
and I think, like is the case with almost everything we talk about, the more you discuss it, the more you become attached to it. It opens itself up to the world of idea just by engaging with it. Whereas if I were reading this on my own, because this is the first time, I've never actually tried to read this before. So this is first attempt and completed it, which is unique, I think, especially for a lot of classic books. Like I've when I was younger, I'd buy them, maybe start one and go, nah. And then it would take multiple attempts, but this was the first try. But yeah, I get it. I can see abandoning ship. There are moments, there are passages and chunks that are seemingly superfluous.
Yeah. I for me, like the whole Swann and Love section, while there's passages in there that are good, I was like, I feel like this is supposed to be the sort of salacious part of the book that gets people to read the rest. And I would just rather skip that and get to the rest until I had a revelation in our reading group, actually, or an epiphany, that what he's making real in the Swann and Love section is also dealing with the world of ideas. It's the obsession in falling in love is maybe the most relatable, the most universal idea that is inescapable for maybe all humans or most humans. And we can't deny it. We can't say, oh, because I can't put it on a scale, it's not real, because it can disrupt your life in a major way. Mm-hmm. And that's what he lays out, the most improbable, in a sort of realistic sense, the most improbable love story, the most, there's a love story without a happy ending that we all relate to. And we're like, oh, I've been there. I know what he's talking about. That's pretty convincing.
You just made me think of how we've all sort of been there, and how I can't remember who's talking. I think it's two people talking about Swann being sort of sad and seemingly down, and how you can't blame him for being in love with someone. And it's
oh yeah,
this is a great passage. This is it.
She added, with the wisdom invariably shown by people who, not being in love themselves, feel that a clever man should only be unhappy about a person who is worth his while, which is rather like being astonished that anyone should condescend to die of cholera at the bidding of so insignificant a creature as the common bacillus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it. That's perfect. It's like, and that's so of the moment, I imagine. I mean, I don't know when they identified that. Was it a bacteria, bacillus? I don't know when they identified that, but that feels like very kind of early modernism. Like, oh, we're figuring stuff out. We're categorizing things. Cholera is caused by this thing. It's real. It's not the effluvium. It's a real thing. Love, on the other hand, that's not real. But bacteria, this is real. And that statement like encapsulates that. It's like, how can you make that? How can you say that just because we've identified this and we haven't identified that? Love is no less real of a thing than this common bacteria that kills you of cholera.
But it's also funny because it's associating something that people consider so wonderful and beautiful with getting a virus.
I mean, it doesn't always feel wonderful.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
And,
for fucking sure.
I think we've all had friends that are with someone, you're like, what the fuck are they doing with that person? Well, he's got the virus. She's got the virus. What are you going to do?
And by friends, you mean that's you and that's what other people are telling you?
Actually, my wife has heard it mostly.
And that's a wrap.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. You can find out about us at booksofsomesubstance.com and on Instagram and Twitter with the handle booksosubstance. Until next time, happy reading. You were just like, hey, this is Nathan.
Hey.
Hey guys.
Now you know how we hear you.
Is that what I sound like?
What?